The Costco gas station was bustling with the usual weekend rush, engines idling, carts clanking, and the low hum of people waiting their turn. Among the crowd was Emily, calm and composed, refueling her car without a second glance at the chaos around her. She didn't draw attention. She never wanted to. But that changed the moment a group of loud, leather-clad bikers rolled into the station, engines revving obnoxiously as they parked beside her. Viper, the group's self-proclaimed leader, made his presence impossible to ignore. Tall, muscular, and arrogant, he thrived on the fear he instilled in others. And when his gaze landed on Emily, alone, quiet, and unimpressed, he saw an easy target. Mistake number 1. At first, it was just crude remarks, whispered insults meant to provoke a reaction. But Emily didn't flinch. She was a master of restraint, forged by years of specialized training most wouldn't even believe. But Viper wouldn't let it go. A shove near her car, a taunt about how women shouldn't be playing tough, then blocking her exit when she tried to leave. Mistake number 2. What they didn't know was that Emily wasn't just a woman minding her own business. She was a former elite military operative, trained not only to defend herself but to end threats with precision. And tonight, when pushed too far, she wouldn't just teach these bikers a lesson. She would end their reign of fear. Mistake number 3 was thinking she wouldn't fight back. The sun hung low in the afternoon sky, casting long shadows over the busy Costco parking lot. A line of cars snaked through the gas station lanes, engines idling as drivers waited patiently for their turn at the pump. The air was thick with the scent of gasoline and hot asphalt, a mundane weekend scene where no one expected conflict. Emily blended into the crowd effortlessly. Her black SUV pulled into one of the fuel lanes as she remained calm, focused. Nothing about her stood out. Simple jeans, a loose navy t-shirt, hair pulled back in a casual ponytail. She was invisible by design, a woman who had spent years perfecting the art of not being noticed. As she inserted the gas nozzle, Emily scanned her surroundings out of habit. Years of military service had conditioned her to assess every environment. Blind spots, exits, unusual behavior. It was second nature now. And that's when she heard them. The growl of motorcycle engines cut through the low hum of conversations and the hiss of fuel pumps. A pack of 6 bikes rolled into the lot, the rumble aggressive and attention-seeking. Chrome gleamed in the sunlight as the riders parked haphazardly near the center pumps, ignoring the line entirely. Emily kept her eyes forward, her pulse steady. She had encountered men like this before. Loud, brash, and desperate for attention. They thrived on dominance, on making people uncomfortable. The leader dismounted first. Viper. Tall, broad-shouldered, his leather vest embroidered with a crimson serpent coiled menacingly across the back. His face was sun-scarred, his arms decorated with tattoos designed to intimidate more than express. He removed his helmet, revealing piercing eyes and a cruel smirk that seemed permanently etched onto his face. Viper didn't just want fuel, he wanted attention. As the other bikers removed their helmets, they immediately began disturbing the peace, loud, mocking laughter, pushing carts aside and cutting in front of a family who had been waiting patiently in their minivan. Emily remained still, observing. But her trained eyes noticed something others didn't. The calculated way Viper scanned the crowd. He wasn't just showing off, he was hunting for an easy target. The young father 2 pumps over caught his attention, a mild-mannered man wearing a polo shirt, clearly uncomfortable as the bikers shoved too close to his family's car. Emily clenched her jaw, every muscle in her body urging her to act. Stay calm. She wasn't here to get involved, not yet. But when Viper deliberately flicked his cigarette toward the father's windshield, grinning as the embers scattered across the glass, Emily felt the shift. The line had been crossed. She returned the nozzle to its holder, quietly stepping out from behind her vehicle. "Hey," she said, voice calm but firm. "That's enough." The bikers went silent. Viper turned slowly, his expression morphing from smug to curious. The entire gas station seemed to pause as tension thickened in the air. "Something you want to say, sweetheart?" Viper sneered, stepping closer with exaggerated confidence. Emily didn't flinch. She met his gaze with calm, steady control, the kind that wasn't born from arrogance but experience. "You've had your fun. Leave them alone." Viper's grin widened. His crew exchanged amused glances, clearly enjoying the idea of a confrontation. "And what are you going to do if we don't?" Viper challenged, spreading his arms wide. "Call the cops. This ain't the movies, lady." Emily didn't blink. "No, I'll handle it myself." The crowd gasped softly. The young father stared, frozen in disbelief. Viper's smirk faltered just a bit. Not enough for most to notice, but Emily did. He wasn't used to being challenged, and he had just made his first mistake. The heat from the sun bore down on the pavement as the tension thickened like a coiled spring ready to snap. The Costco gas station, once filled with the hum of idling engines and murmured conversations, had gone silent. All eyes were locked on the unfolding confrontation between Viper and Emily. Viper's smirk twisted into something more dangerous as he took a slow step closer, his heavy boots scuffing the pavement. The scent of gasoline mixed with the tang of cigarette smoke lingering from the discarded ember he'd flicked just moments earlier. "Lady, I don't think you know who you're talking to," he said, voice low, threatening. Emily held her ground. She didn't step back, didn't flinch. Her body language remained calm, but her mind was already calculating. Distance, angles, positioning. She could feel the weight of the crowd watching, the father clutching his daughter protectively behind him, unsure whether to intervene or retreat. "I know exactly who I'm talking to," Emily replied, voice steady. "A bully trying to scare people because it makes him feel powerful." The crowd murmured. Viper's men exchanged glances, some stifling, uncomfortable chuckles. One of them, a lanky biker with a skull bandana covering his face, whispered, "You gonna let her talk to you like that, Viper?" Viper's face darkened. He wasn't just angry now, he was embarrassed. And men like Viper couldn't stand public humiliation. The gang leader exhaled sharply, leaning closer, invading her space. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper, low enough that only she could hear. "You think you're tough, huh? I could break you in half, lady. Don't test me." Emily met his glare without a trace of fear. "I've faced worse than you, Viper," she said, just loud enough for those nearest to hear. "And I didn't back down then either." A ripple moved through the crowd. Viper's nostrils flared. The tension in his jaw told Emily he was fighting the impulse to lash out, yet something held him back. Maybe it was the unwavering calm in her eyes. Maybe it was the fact that she hadn't backed up even an inch. But his pride wouldn't let him leave quietly. Viper chuckled, loud and forced, turning back toward his crew with exaggerated bravado. "Look at this. Miss Action Hero here thinks she can lecture me about respect." Emily let the silence work against him. The crowd wasn't laughing. A few bystanders were even recording now, phones raised discreetly. Viper noticed. His smirk wavered. "Tell you what," he sneered, trying to regain control. "How about we make this interesting? Step back, mind your business, and nobody gets hurt." Emily tilted her head, eyes narrowing slightly. "You're the one who needs to back down, Viper. This is over." Viper's eyes narrowed, but his ego demanded a spectacle. Without warning, he reached for the gas pump hose, yanking it hard enough to spill a few drops of fuel onto the ground. The crowd gasped. Emily's stance shifted, subtle but prepared. Viper's grin returned. "Oops, Butterfingers." That was enough. Before he could react, Emily moved. A blur of precision. She stepped forward, twisted the gas nozzle from his grip, and in a single smooth motion, locked his wrist with just enough pressure to make his knees buckle slightly. "Stop." The word was delivered with such forceful calm that Viper froze on instinct, blinking in disbelief. She released him, letting his wrist drop back to his side, unhurt but humiliated. Viper staggered back a step, massaging his wrist, his expression a mixture of rage and disbelief. You. Emily didn't give him the satisfaction of a response. She simply held his gaze. This is done. Walk away, Viper. The crowd waited, tense, watching. For a heartbeat, it seemed like he might lunge, but then his eyes darted around the station, the phones still recording, his crew watching silently. No backup, no support. His authority was slipping. With a snarl, Viper spat on the ground. You'll regret this, lady. He turned sharply, storming back toward his bike. His crew followed, less enthusiastic than when they'd arrived. The roar of their engines filled the air as they peeled out of the parking lot, leaving only the scent of burnt rubber behind. The young father Emily had quietly defended stepped forward, his daughter still holding his hand. Thank you, he said softly, voice shaking. I didn't know what to do. Emily nodded, offering a small reassuring smile. You did the right thing staying calm. They feed off fear. Don't give them any. The father nodded, clearly shaken but grateful. Emily returned to her car, her heart steady despite the adrenaline still humming in her veins. She had diffused the situation. But as she watched the trail of exhaust smoke fade into the distance, she knew Viper wasn't finished. Men like him never were. The sun dipped lower in the sky as the Costco gas station gradually emptied. Families packed their cars with bulk groceries, and the soft hum of engines faded into the distance. The confrontation had ended, for now. But Emily knew it wasn't over. She remained calm as she returned to her car, finishing her refueling while keeping a subtle watch on her surroundings. Years of combat training had taught her to never turn her back on unfinished threats. Viper's parting words weren't just bluster, they were a promise. And she had seen that promise before. After the bikers had roared out of the lot, the tension in the air had shifted. But it hadn't disappeared. Some of the remaining patrons had approached the young father she defended, asking if he was okay, murmuring about what they had just witnessed. Emily overheard snippets. That woman, who was she? She didn't even flinch. Think the cops will show up? Emily didn't care about the whispers. She wasn't there to be a spectacle. She just wanted to finish her task and leave. But something gnawed at her. Viper hadn't left defeated. He had left humiliated. And men like him didn't lick their wounds quietly. They regrouped. They retaliated. Emily didn't take the main roads home. Her instincts had kicked into high alert as she drove, deliberately shifting her route through side streets, making unnecessary turns, testing for a tail. And she was right. In her rearview mirror, just barely visible through the sea of traffic, was a black motorcycle. No chrome this time. No obnoxious revving. But the rider was familiar. One of Viper's men. Not making a move, just tracking her. Good. If they wanted to play this game, she would let them. On her terms. She pulled into a small, nearly empty parking lot just outside a coffee shop on the quieter side of town. A tactical choice, open space, visibility, no nearby alleys for an ambush. The motorcycle pulled up across the street, lingering just long enough for her to see before disappearing behind a row of parked cars. She let them wait. Minutes passed. They were watching, calculating. She gave them a reason to think they had control. Sliding on a pair of sunglasses, Emily stepped inside the coffee shop, ordered a simple black coffee, and took a corner seat where she had a full view of the front door and both exits. A waitress approached, her voice cheerful but cautious. "Rough day." Emily offered a faint smile. "You could say that." She wasn't here for small talk. Her mind was already working through the next steps. If they were watching, they wanted her to feel surrounded. But they weren't closing in yet. Viper's strategy had shifted. He was testing her reactions, looking for weaknesses. There were none. 30 minutes later. Emily walked back to her SUV, deliberately keeping her movements relaxed, normal. The bike was still there, half concealed behind a delivery truck down the block. She felt it. The tension. The next test was coming. The moment she opened her car door, a voice echoed from behind her. "Hey, lady!" She turned, calm but alert. It was Skull, the lanky biker with the bandana. He'd approached on foot, keeping a calculated distance as he spread his arms wide in mock innocence. "Look, we got off on the wrong foot earlier," he said, smirking. "Boss just wanted me to deliver a message." Emily's gaze stayed steady. "You can tell him I'm not interested." Skull's smirk widened. "Nah, see, he's not really asking. He's saying you embarrassed him back there, made him look weak in front of the crew, and, well," he took a step closer. "That kind of thing, it don't sit well with him." Emily didn't move. "Is this the part where you try to scare me?" she asked, voice measured. Skull's smile faltered just slightly. "You got guts, lady. I'll give you that. But guts ain't gonna help you next time. He ain't gonna let it go. He's coming for you. Real soon." Emily stepped forward, closing the distance between them just enough that Skull blinked in surprise. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Let me be clear. Tell your boss he's making another mistake. I don't scare easy. And if he pushes this, he won't like how it ends." Skull blinked, the bravado cracking. "Yeah? We'll see." He backed away, his body language stiffer than when he had arrived. She let him go. Not out of mercy, but because she wanted Viper to know. She wasn't running. Later that night, Emily's home. The quiet suburban street seemed peaceful, but Emily's guard never dropped. She double-checked the locks on every door, blinds drawn, lights low. Years of experience taught her to sleep lightly. But even as she lay awake, listening for the faintest sound outside, she knew this wasn't over. The next move would be his. And when it came, she'd be ready. The night had been quiet. Too quiet. Emily hadn't slept. Not fully. She had drifted in and out, mind alert for the smallest noise outside her home. The tension from the Costco confrontation still lingered, the threat unresolved. Viper was still out there, watching, plotting, and he was running out of patience. The next afternoon, Costco parking lot. Emily had returned to Costco, not out of recklessness but for control, staying visible, facing the threat head-on rather than waiting for it to fester in the shadows. She wasn't going to live in fear, but as she pulled into the parking lot, something felt off. The tension was heavier than before. The same black motorcycle from the night prior was back, parked this time right near the outer edges of the lot, empty, watching. Emily exhaled slowly. "They're testing me again." She calmly parked closer to the gas station, checking her surroundings before stepping out. The fuel lanes were moderately busy, families refueling for weekend trips, kids hanging out of minivans as parents pumped gas. And then, Viper appeared. This time, he wasn't hiding in the background. He stepped out from between two parked trucks, leather vest on full display, followed closely by Skull and two other bikers. They didn't speak immediately. They just lingered, watching, blocking her line of sight to the exit. Emily didn't react. She slid her card into the pump, focused on her task, though every fiber of her being tracked their movements with precision. Finally, Viper spoke. "Look who came back," he called out, loud enough for the nearby crowd to hear. I guess she didn't get the message the first time. Emily remained silent, refueling her SUV without glancing in his direction. That wasn't the reaction Viper wanted. His voice sharpened. "Hey, lady, I'm talking to you." The nearby customers began taking notice. Some turned away uncomfortably, hoping to avoid involvement. Others exchanged worried glances. Emily finished pumping, setting the nozzle back in its holder. Calmly, she turned. "Are we really doing this again, Viper?" The biker's smirk returned, his crew spreading slightly, forming a loose semicircle behind him. A tactical move. Emily noticed the positioning immediately. "You think you can keep humiliating me in front of my guys?" Viper growled, stepping closer, just outside arm's reach. "I'm not humiliating you, Viper. You're doing that all on your own." A low rumble of murmured whispers rippled through the crowd. Someone pulled out their phone, recording the interaction. Viper's face flushed with anger. "That's it," he spat. "No more talking." He lunged, fast, reckless, all muscle and no discipline. Emily had already anticipated it. She sidestepped with perfect precision, his fist missing her shoulder by inches. In the same fluid motion, she caught his wrist, twisting it just enough to throw him off balance. His body hit the side of a gas pump with a thud. Viper groaned, stumbling back, clutching his wrist. His eyes flared with rage and disbelief. Skull, watching from behind, stepped forward instinctively, but Emily's gaze snapped to him. "Don't." The single word was calm but commanding, and Skull hesitated. The crowd was fully watching now, recording, whispering. No one stepped in. Too shocked, too curious. Viper staggered back to his feet, face red with fury. "You think you're tough?" he growled, spitting on the ground. "You think this is over?" Emily's voice didn't waver. "I know it's over. Walk away, Viper. Go home. This doesn't have to end badly for you." But Viper wasn't listening. Humiliated, angry. He lashed out again, but this time, with a flick of his hand, a blade appeared. A switchblade. The crowd gasped audibly. But Emily's focus sharpened. He's out of control now. The knife was flashy, more for show than function. His grip was wrong, his stance emotional and unbalanced. Predictable. Viper charged. Emily deflected his arm with a sharp strike to his forearm, the blade clattering to the pavement. With fluid efficiency, she swept his legs from beneath him, driving his back to the ground with a controlled impact. He grunted, wind knocked from his lungs. This time she didn't release him. Emily pinned his wrist, keeping his arm twisted just enough for pain, but no permanent damage. The gas station manager had finally rushed out, panicked and speaking into a radio. "Security! Now!" Viper coughed, struggling beneath her hold. "You done," Emily said quietly, leaning close enough that only he could hear. His pride was shattered, his gang frozen in place, unsure whether to step in or not. I said, "Are you done?" Finally, the fight left his eyes. He stopped struggling. Emily released him carefully, stepping back just as the first security guard arrived, followed by local law enforcement. 10 minutes later, police intervention. The officers spoke to multiple witnesses, reviewing the footage from the phones. The stories were all the same. Viper had escalated. Emily had defended herself. One officer approached her as another cuffed Viper and led him toward a patrol car. "Ma'am, you handled yourself well. It's pretty clear he was the aggressor here. Do you want to press charges?" Emily shook her head. "No need. I think he's already learned his lesson." Viper glared from the back seat of the patrol car. But this time, there was no more defiance. Just shame. And yet, deep down, Emily knew this wasn't the end. Not yet. The low hum of the engines had quieted, the chaos finally diffusing as the flashing lights of the police cruiser faded down the street. Costco employees were still murmuring in the aftermath of the confrontation, customers whispering as they watched the scene from a distance. Emily remained near her vehicle, calm but alert, scanning the area for any lingering threats. Though Viper had been hauled off in cuffs, she knew from experience that situations like this didn't simply end. It wasn't just about Viper. It was about the power he had tried to project, and losing control in front of his crew had cracked his authority in a way she knew he wouldn't forget. "Ma'am?" The gas station manager approached carefully, a balding man in his late 50s with a Costco badge clipped to his windbreaker. His name tag read Gary. His face was flushed with anxiety, the lingering adrenaline making his hands tremble slightly as he adjusted his glasses. I need to speak with you," Gary said cautiously. "Do you have a moment?" Emily nodded, crossing her arms but keeping her voice neutral. "Of course." Gary glanced over his shoulder at the remaining bikers, now clustered near the parking lot exit. They weren't causing trouble, yet, just watching. But their presence was enough to keep the crowd uneasy. Gary cleared his throat, voice lowered. "Look, I saw the footage. The officer showed it to me. I understand you didn't start anything here, but—" He hesitated, his words carefully chosen. "But you're worried this will escalate further," Emily finished for him, her gaze still sweeping the lot. Gary nodded, exhaling sharply. "Exactly. This store has a reputation. Family shop here. I don't want trouble, but I can't have this kind of thing happening again. It's bad for business." Emily nodded, but there was a cool edge to her tone. "So, what exactly are you asking me, Gary? To stay away? For defending myself?" Gary shook his head quickly. No, that's not what I mean. I'm just—" He gestured vaguely toward the cluster of remaining bikers. "I'm just asking if—" "It's over." Emily's eyes narrowed slightly as she studied the bikers. Skull was among them, leaning on his bike, arms crossed. But his posture wasn't aggressive anymore. It was hesitant, uncertain. She let the silence linger for a beat before speaking. "I can't promise they won't come back," Emily said evenly, "but I can promise you one thing. If they do, they won't get what they're looking for." Gary shifted awkwardly, still uncomfortable. "That's good, I guess. I'll just file the report for corporate and—" The conversation was cut short as Skull began to walk toward them. Gary immediately tensed, stepping back toward the door. But Emily? She didn't move. Skull approached slowly, hands visible, posture far from threatening. He stopped a few feet away, expression hard but not defiant this time. His eyes shifted from Gary to Emily. "We need to talk," Skull said, his voice lower than before. Emily didn't blink. "Here's your chance. Talk." Skull glanced around, lowering his voice even more. "Not here, just you and me. Out by the far side of the lot. No games, no backup." Gary's eyes widened. "Wait, are you serious? Ma'am, you don't need to go anywhere alone with this guy." "I'm fine," Emily said quietly, already stepping forward. She wasn't afraid, but her mind was calculating, analyzing every angle. Skull wasn't radiating aggression this time. He seemed cautious, almost conflicted. She followed him at a safe distance toward the far corner of the parking lot, where the wind carried the scent of gasoline and the faint hum of traffic echoed from the nearby road. When they were out of earshot, Skull turned to face her. "Look, I didn't come over here to fight," he started, voice losing the bravado he'd shown earlier. Emily folded her arms. "Then why are you here?" Skull shifted on his feet, uncomfortable. "What happened back there? Viper crossed the line. You didn't deserve that. The way you handled it—" He exhaled, clearly struggling for the words. "It wasn't what we signed up for. It was supposed to be just us messing around, scaring people a little, not whatever that was." Emily studied him, searching for deception but finding none. "So what now?" she asked bluntly. "You done with his games? Or are you just here because he got arrested?" Skull shook his head. "No, I'm here because you showed us something he never did. Control. Strength without needing to break people." Emily's gaze remained steady. "Then walk away, all of you." Skull hesitated, swallowing hard. "I can't just leave. We owe him. Loyalty means something, you know?" She stepped closer. "Loyalty isn't fear. You're not loyal to Viper. You're scared of him. There's a difference. If you keep following him, it won't end with a confrontation like this. Next time, someone will get hurt, or worse." Skull looked down, processing her words. Finally, he nodded once. "I'll talk to the others, but you should know, he's not done with you. He doesn't forget. Ever." Emily's jaw tightened. "I'm counting on that." Back inside the store. Gary watched nervously as Emily returned from the far side of the parking lot. "Well?" he asked as she approached. "It's handled," she said simply. Gary raised an eyebrow. "And what if they come back?" Emily exhaled slowly, giving him a calm, determined look. "Then I'll handle it again." The sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the Costco parking lot as Emily drove home. The encounter with Skull lingered in her mind, replaying in fragments. His hesitation, the crack in his voice, the look of uncertainty when he spoke about loyalty. But Emily wasn't fooled. He may have seemed genuine, but Viper's influence ran deep. Fear had a way of twisting people's choices, and she knew Skull's moment of doubt could easily be swept away by the next surge of bravado. And she was right. Later that night, Emily's home. The sound of the wind brushing against the trees outside her window was steady, rhythmic. Emily sat in her living room, the television playing softly in the background, though she wasn't really watching. The feeling was back. That pull in her gut, the one she had learned to trust. She checked the front door, locked, windows secured, lights strategically low to avoid drawing attention. But the feeling didn't go away. She moved to the corner of the living room, slipping a compact black tactical flashlight from the drawer and holding it loosely as she peered through the blinds. Nothing. Just the quiet suburban street bathed in pale moonlight. But she knew. They're out there. 11:57 p.m., the backyard. A faint crunch echoed from the gravel outside. Emily didn't react right away. She waited, controlling her breathing, body still, listening. Then another sound. A low murmur. Male voices. 2, maybe 3. They weren't breaking in. Not yet. Testing her. Pushing her, just like before. Emily's instincts took over. She didn't grab her phone or call for help. This wasn't that kind of situation. They weren't here to rob her. They were here to make a point. And so was she. Outside. The back gate creaked open. 2 figures emerged cautiously from the shadows, both clad in dark jackets, moving with the subtle clumsiness of men trying too hard to be stealthy. Skull was one of them. The other, a younger recruit she hadn't seen before, his face pale under the dim streetlight glow. They whispered in hushed tones as they approached the side of her house. "Man, this feels stupid. She already took out Viper." "She needs a reminder," Skull hissed back, voice forced with more confidence than he felt. "Viper said we had to finish what he started." A shadow moved behind them. Emily. She stepped forward deliberately, letting her boot scuff the gravel just enough to be heard. The sound was subtle, but unmistakable. Skull spun around, startled. His younger companion took a half-step back, clutching his jacket. "Leaving so soon?" Emily's voice cut through the darkness, calm but commanding. Skull's face twisted in frustration, masking his fear. "We weren't doing anything, just talking." Emily crossed her arms, her tactical flashlight angled slightly to avoid blinding them, but illuminating her face enough to remind them exactly who they were dealing with. "You were sent here," she said, voice like steel. "By Viper, right?" Neither spoke. "Let me make something clear," she continued, stepping closer, slow and deliberate. "This isn't some playground fight. This is harassment, trespassing. I've given you enough chances to walk away, but since words haven't worked—" She closed the gap in a single step, grabbing Skull's wrist with controlled precision, twisting it just enough to make him stumble. The younger biker flinched but didn't intervene. Pain, Emily said, her voice deadly quiet, is a powerful teacher, but you won't forget it when it's applied the right way. With a smooth pivot, she released Skull's arm, making him stagger backward. No permanent damage, just enough pressure to break his ego. Get out, she ordered, voice sharper now, and tell Viper he's running out of moves. Skull hesitated for a split second, but the younger biker was already backing away. Come on, man, this ain't worth it. They fled into the darkness, leaving Emily alone in the silence. Inside, minutes later, Emily stood by her window, watching as the two bikers disappeared down the street on foot. No threats, no retaliation. But this wasn't over. Viper was playing a game, probing for weakness, and when he realized she wouldn't fold, he'd try something worse. She was ready. The following morning, the sun crept over the horizon, casting soft streaks of gold across the neighborhood. Emily sat at her kitchen table, the scent of black coffee curling through the air as she stared out the window. Calm, still, but not peaceful. Her mind replayed the previous night, Skull's hesitation, the younger bikers' retreat, the way they had fled without finishing what they started. It was a win, but not a victory. Men like Viper didn't just quit. This morning was too quiet, and Emily had learned long ago, quiet meant something was coming. Costco, noon. The atmosphere at the gas station was back to its usual routine, families refueling SUVs, carts packed with bulk items, cashiers smiling under the summer sun. But today felt different. Emily noticed the shift immediately as she pulled into the lot. Conversations were hushed. Patrons seemed more cautious. A few cast wary glances toward the far end of the station. Then she saw it. The bikes. A row of them, chrome glinting in the sunlight, parked in perfect formation near the entrance to the food court. 7 this time. But Viper wasn't with them. She scanned the lot carefully, her instincts on edge, and then she spotted him. Across the street, perched on a bench like a king overseeing his territory. Viper sat back, sunglasses on, his bruised wrist still wrapped from their last confrontation. A smug smile played across his face. He's making a spectacle. This wasn't a confrontation. It was a statement. He had gathered his crew back together, trying to show the world he still had control. But Emily wasn't here to play his games. She fueled her SUV calmly, ignoring the stares, the phones recording from a distance, the subtle tension hanging over the crowd. But as she finished, Skull appeared again, this time with more confidence. He approached from the left, hands in his jacket pockets, moving deliberately. But Emily noticed the tension in his shoulders. He wasn't there for small talk. Viper had sent him. You made your point last night, Skull said, voice lower than before, less forced bravado. But Viper's got something to say. You owe him a conversation. Emily didn't respond immediately. She finished replacing the nozzle and closed the gas cap with slow precision. Then she turned to face him. I don't owe him anything. Skull flinched slightly, but he didn't back down. Look, you've embarrassed him twice now. He ain't gonna let it go. Come talk to him. Settle it. No more games. Emily held his gaze, calm but firm. I'm done with warnings. If he has something to say, he can say it here. Across the street, Viper watches. Viper's jaw tightened as he watched the exchange. He had expected fear, hesitation, but Emily wasn't playing the part. She hadn't flinched, and now people were watching again, some recording, others whispering. His own men looked uncomfortable. Skull was standing there, looking like he was asking permission instead of delivering a threat. Humiliation. Viper shot to his feet. Enough was enough. Back at the pumps, the roar of Viper's motorcycle echoed through the parking lot as he crossed the street alone, his bike skidding to a halt near Emily's SUV. Conversations stopped. Phones went up. The gas station manager had stepped outside, already on the phone with security, his expression tight with worry. But Emily, she was calm. Viper dismounted slowly, yanking off his sunglasses. His face was pale with barely controlled rage. "This is how it's going to be, huh?" His voice was sharp, echoing louder than necessary. For the crowd. "You think you're better than me? That you can just humiliate me in front of my crew?" Emily tilted her head slightly. "I think you're proving my point, Viper." The crowd murmured. Viper's fists clenched. "You're playing with fire, lady. This was supposed to end last time, but you're pushing it. And trust me, when I push back—" "No, Viper," she interrupted. "You don't get it. You already lost." Viper's face twisted. The crowd wasn't on his side anymore. The illusion of control was crumbling, and for the first time, his own men seemed unsure, shuffling, exchanging uneasy glances. Skull shifted uncomfortably, clearly questioning why this spectacle was even happening. Emily could see it all falling apart. And so could Viper. His face turned crimson, desperate to reclaim the power he was losing. "You don't scare me," he growled. "You think you're some kind of hero? You're just a scared little girl with a few lucky moves. But guess what?" He took a step forward. Too close. Emily didn't move. She didn't need to, because before Viper could finish, Skull finally spoke. "Boss, just let it go, man." The words hit harder than any punch. Viper spun toward him, eyes blazing. "What did you just say?" Skull held his ground, his voice louder this time. "I said, let it go. We're done, man. This ain't it." The shift was undeniable now. Two other bikers nodded subtly, stepping back. Viper had lost control. Completely. And the only thing more dangerous than a man with too much power was a man losing it all. The Costco confrontation had left the parking lot buzzing with tension. Viper's authority was crumbling, his crew questioning his leadership for the first time. Emily had stood her ground, calm and unshaken. But she knew men like Viper didn't disappear after a public defeat. They got desperate. They got dangerous. Later, that night, Emily's home. The suburban streets were quiet. Streetlights buzzed faintly, their dim glow casting long shadows across the pavement. Emily sat in her living room, the blinds drawn but slightly cracked, allowing her to keep an eye on the street. Her instincts were sharper than ever. She wasn't paranoid. She was prepared. And she wasn't wrong. At 10:47 p.m., the rumble of a motorcycle engine broke the silence. It wasn't loud or aggressive like before. This wasn't an entrance. It was a message. Emily remained seated, her breathing slow, controlled. She didn't react. The engine idled at the end of her street for nearly a full minute. Then, without fanfare, it pulled away into the darkness. Testing. He wanted her to know he was still watching, still present, but he wasn't ready to strike yet. Soon. The next day. Shadowed movements. It wasn't paranoia when Emily noticed the patterns. The same black motorcycle lingering at the far end of the Costco lot when she stopped to pick up groceries. The same unfamiliar sedan parked 2 spaces over when she left the gym that afternoon. The second biker from Viper's crew, wearing a different jacket but keeping his face low under a cap, following, waiting. He wasn't subtle, but he wasn't supposed to be. Viper wants me to feel watched. Emily's response. Control the battlefield. She didn't ignore the stalking. She controlled it. Emily began running small counter-surveillance tests, basic strategies she had used overseas during recon assignments. Change of routine. She altered her schedule, taking different routes to her destinations, parking in unpredictable spots. Tail confirmations. Sudden turns, random stops in public places. Each time, the tail hesitated. Confirmed. Pressure response. She walked through the same hardware store twice without buying anything. On the second pass, the tail blinked. A rookie mistake. They're watching, but they're amateurs. Viper was playing a psychological game, but Emily, she was playing for real. Evening. The test escalates. The motorcycle came back that night. 11:03 p.m. This time, it didn't linger at the end of the street. It stopped directly in front of her house. The soft purr of the engine filled the silence like a predator waiting for a reaction. Emily didn't give them one. Instead, she turned off all the lights inside. The house went dark. No movement, no confrontation. But she was watching from the shadows. The biker stayed for 5 minutes, then 10. And finally, as if frustrated by the lack of response, the motorcycle revved once and sped off into the night. The mistake they didn't realize. The moment the bike left, Emily moved. She had already memorized the license plate from the previous nights. A small detail, but a critical one. And now it was time to shift the control. Using secure contacts from her past, she ran the plate through a private civilian database. Nothing criminal flagged, yet, but the name attached confirmed what she already suspected. The second biker, the younger recruit. But there was something else. The address listed wasn't connected to any clubhouse, no gang hangout. It was an old industrial lot, abandoned, their staging nearby, and that meant one thing. The next move was coming, and this time it wouldn't just be mind games. Final warning. The following day, a message appeared on her windshield when she returned from the gym. A plain, white envelope tucked neatly under her wipers. No name, no symbol, just 5 words scrawled in red ink. You should have stayed quiet. Emily stared at the note, her heartbeat steady but cold. She folded the paper carefully and slipped it into her jacket pocket, exhaling softly. Viper had just crossed a line. And now, she was done waiting. The message on her windshield hadn't shaken Emily. If anything, it had solidified her resolve. Viper wasn't backing down. He was escalating. And she wasn't going to sit back and wait for him to decide when the next move came. It was time to set the trap. Preparation. Controlled moves. Emily's training resurfaced, her mind sharpening as she slipped back into operational mode. Control the environment, limit their options, disarm their confidence. She began altering her routine even more deliberately, choosing locations where visibility was high, where Viper's men would have to make themselves obvious. They followed. The same black motorcycle, the same sedan. Always at a distance, always trying to stay just outside of detection range. But she let them believe they were still in control. The setup: old industrial lot. The address tied to the second biker had been the key, an abandoned industrial lot on the outskirts of town, the perfect location for a confrontation. Isolated, empty, no casual witnesses. Exactly the kind of place they would feel comfortable. And so, she chose it. That evening, Emily parked her SUV just outside the rusted chain-link fence surrounding the lot. Overgrown weeds pressed against the concrete, the building itself looming dark and silent beneath the pale moonlight. She had deliberately made herself seen earlier that day, ensuring Viper's crew would track her here. The bait was set, and the trap was ready to spring. 11:20 p.m. The bikers arrive. The low growl of motorcycle engines echoed off the metal walls, growing louder as the group approached. 4 bikes this time. Viper leading the pack, his bruised wrist still bandaged but his smirk back in full force. Emily remained still, standing near the center of the lot with her hands at her sides. She wasn't armed. She didn't need to be. Viper dismounted first, boots crunching against the gravel as he approached. Skull followed closely, though his posture was noticeably less confident than before. The others stayed back, flanking their leader like shadows. Viper stopped just outside arm's reach. The silence was deafening. "So," he began, voice dripping with forced confidence. "Looks like you finally figured out how this works. You knew we'd follow you here, huh?" Emily's gaze remained steady. "I didn't figure anything out, Viper. I planned it." The smirk wavered. "Funny," he muttered, masking his discomfort, "because it looks like you're alone. No cops, no backup. You finally ran out of bluffs." Emily took a step closer. "I don't need backup. You came here because you think fear is control, but it's not, and you're about to find out why." Viper's jaw tightened. The confidence was slipping, his crew watching too closely now. He's losing them. But the adrenaline was twisting him further. "I've had enough of this tough act," Viper snapped, his voice echoing across the empty lot. "You think you're special? You think you can keep embarrassing me in front of my guys? This ends tonight." And then, he reached for the knife. The attack. The switchblade gleamed under the dim lighting, the blade flicking open with a sharp metallic snap. But Emily wasn't focused on the weapon. She was focused on his wrist. He lunged, reckless, emotional. She caught his arm mid-swing, twisting his wrist outward in a precise maneuver, forcing his grip open. The knife clattered to the ground. Viper roared in pain, staggering back. But Emily didn't let go. She swept his leg in a single fluid motion, driving his back to the cracked concrete with a controlled but punishing impact. Pinned. "Enough," Emily said, her voice echoing across the lot. The other bikers froze. No one moved. No one wanted to be next. Viper struggled, breath ragged beneath her grip. His pride was shattered, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Listen carefully," she said quietly, only for him to hear. "You came here thinking this was strength, that fear was power, but it's not. Control is not power. And your crew, they're not loyal to you. They're afraid of you." Viper didn't speak. She leaned closer. "And that's why you've already lost." Emily released him, standing tall as he clutched his arm, coughing as he struggled to his feet. The other bikers didn't move. They just stared. Skull looked away. One of the younger recruits shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward his bike like he wanted to leave. And that was the moment Viper realized. He had lost more than a fight. He had lost respect. Emily's final words. "This is over," Emily said, her voice cutting through the silence. "You come near me again. This won't end with warnings." She turned her back on him, a final show of dominance as she walked toward her SUV. And not one of them dared to follow. The night air clung thick and heavy, silence hanging over the abandoned lot as Emily stepped away from the defeated figure of Viper. His shallow breathing echoed faintly, his wounded pride more visible than the bruises beginning to form on his wrist. She knew the confrontation wasn't just physical. It had broken something deeper inside him. But broken pride could be far more dangerous than a shattered bone. Emily felt the stares of the remaining bikers watching her every move as she approached her SUV. They weren't just in shock, they were reconsidering everything. Behind her, Viper staggered to his feet, coughing as he clutched his wrist. His face was pale, eyes flicking toward his crew as if searching for backup. None came. Skull avoided his gaze entirely, the younger bikers shifting uncomfortably, their bravado fading. No more mocking laughs, no threats, just hesitation. But Emily knew men like Viper. Humiliation didn't lead to surrender. It led to obsession. If he wasn't stopped now, his desperation would fester, growing into something worse. The silence was only temporary. She opened her car door but didn't enter. She stood with her back partially turned, yet fully aware of every movement behind her. Viper was still standing there, trembling with rage, shoulders heaving as if he was trying to summon the courage to speak. Finally, he did. "This ain't over," he hissed, voice raw but lacking the bite it once had. "You think you're untouchable. You just made the biggest mistake of your life." Emily turned back toward him, calm but unyielding. "The only mistake I made was giving you too many chances. Walk away, Viper. This is the last time you'll get one." He opened his mouth, but the words wouldn't come. Skull stepped forward instead, his voice softer, hesitant. "Boss, maybe we should just let this go." Viper spun on him with wild eyes. "Let this go? You gonna take her side now?" Skull didn't flinch but didn't answer either. The damage had already been done. The fracture in his control was complete, and Emily could see it clearly now. The crew wasn't just doubting him. They were losing respect entirely. Viper wasn't a leader anymore. He was a liability. As the tension stretched, Emily made her final move. "You want this to be over? Then prove it. Walk away with what little respect you have left, or keep pushing until there's nothing left of you." The words hit harder than any blow she had delivered that night. Viper's fists clenched, his lips curling as he stared at her. But the fight was gone. He knew it. The crew knew it. And most importantly, he knew they knew it. Without another word, he turned away, limping toward his bike. Skull and the others exchanged uncertain glances before following, though at a noticeable distance. Engines ignited, the rumble deafening against the quiet lot. Emily didn't move until the roar of their departure faded completely into the night. Only then did she exhale, tension finally leaving her shoulders. Driving home, she felt the weight of what had just unfolded. It wasn't just a personal victory. She had dismantled a toxic power structure without resorting to unnecessary violence. But a gnawing thought remained. Men like Viper didn't forget. They didn't reflect. They stewed. And when a man like him had nothing left to lose, the real danger began. As she pulled into her driveway, the neighborhood was silent, the streetlights flickering gently overhead. She scanned the area once more, checking the parked cars, the sidewalks, the rooftops. Clear, for now. But she knew this wasn't the end. Not yet. Inside, Emily double-checked the locks, her mind still calculating possibilities. Viper had been embarrassed, but the next time, he wouldn't just bring his pride. He'd bring desperation, and desperate men were the most dangerous of all. She didn't sleep that night. The next morning arrived with the kind of heavy stillness that signaled unfinished business. Emily stood at her kitchen window, watching the sun creep above the rooftops, staining the sky with pale hues of orange and pink. The world outside looked peaceful, ordinary. Birds chirped, sprinklers hissed over freshly watered lawns, and the gentle hum of traffic in the distance painted a picture of normalcy. But Emily wasn't deceived by appearances. She had woken long before dawn, mind racing with the echoes of last night's confrontation. She replayed every detail, the crack in Viper's voice, the way Skull had hesitated, how the younger bikers had shifted uncomfortably as their leader fell apart before them. The cracks were growing, but she could feel it. Viper wasn't done. He hadn't learned. Not yet. A sudden buzz from her phone broke her thoughts. She glanced down. An unknown number. She answered without speaking, her instincts kicking in immediately. Silence. Just the faintest sound of breathing. Then a whisper. "You think this is over?" The call ended. Emily's grip on the phone tightened. The message was clear. He wasn't backing down. He was escalating. The day passed in a haze of quiet tension. Emily went about her routine, maintaining the same calm, methodical movements she always had. But beneath the surface, her mind remained locked in a state of heightened awareness. She double-checked her windows, ran the security system diagnostics again, made mental notes of potential vulnerabilities around the property. By mid-afternoon, she had already noticed the signs. A black motorcycle parked 2 blocks away, never moving for hours. A man at the far corner of the grocery store parking lot, lingering by the carts without ever stepping inside. They weren't subtle. They weren't meant to be. Viper was pressing her, testing her resolve, hoping to shake her into making the wrong move, but he was forgetting something important. She was trained for this. By nightfall, the tension had reached a peak. Emily could feel it in the air, the way the shadows stretched longer, the silence in the street pressing heavier than usual. She had already decided not to wait. If Viper wanted a confrontation, she was going to bring it to him, on her terms. She left the lights in her house on, deliberately keeping the curtains slightly parted, a subtle invitation, an illusion of vulnerability. But she wasn't inside. She was in the shadows, crouched behind the hedges along the perimeter of her property, blending seamlessly with the darkness. Her breathing was steady, controlled. The soft weight of the tactical flashlight in her hand felt as familiar as her heartbeat. Then she heard it. The soft crunch of gravel. Slow, deliberate. Two figures moved along the side of her house, pausing just before reaching the back fence. Skull and another younger recruit. Not Viper, not the leader. Of course he didn't come himself. The two lingered just outside the fence line, whispering. She caught fragments of the conversation. Skull's voice, nervous but trying to sound composed. "She's got to be inside. Boss said just leave the message and go." The younger one, hesitant. "What if she catches us? Man, this feels wrong. She didn't even do anything." Skull cut him off. "Just do it. We're already here." Emily stepped from the shadows. "You're not as invisible as you think." The men froze. Skull spun, his hand reflexively reaching for something in his jacket, but Emily had already closed the gap. "I wouldn't." Her voice cut through the darkness like steel, and Skull stopped, hand hovering inches from his pocket where she assumed a blade rested. The younger recruit looked terrified. We're just here to—" "To what?" Emily interrupted, stepping closer, her flashlight illuminating their faces. "Deliver another threat? Scare me again? Because I've already given you more than enough warnings." Skull swallowed hard, trying to hold his composure but failing. "Look, it ain't personal. Viper, he's not going to stop. He said you made him look weak. We're just doing what we're told." Emily nodded, calm but relentless. "And what happens when you become the one he blames next? How long before you're the target?" Skull blinked, caught off guard. The younger recruit shifted uncomfortably, already starting to back away. Emily's voice lowered, icy and measured. "Loyalty based on fear isn't loyalty. It's control. And I'm giving you both a choice. Walk away now, or be there when he finally destroys everything, including you." The younger biker's resolve broke first. He nodded, backing further into the shadows. Skull hesitated, fists clenching as though weighing his pride against the obvious reality. Finally, he exhaled sharply, muttering under his breath. "This ain't worth it." They turned and left. Emily didn't move. She watched until they disappeared into the night, only allowing herself to breathe fully once the silence returned. But this wasn't over. Viper hadn't sent them for violence tonight. He had sent them to test her reaction. And now he would know the truth. She wasn't afraid. And next time, she'd be ready. The silence of the night stretched long after Skull and his companion disappeared into the shadows. Emily stood at the edge of her property, the cool night air brushing against her skin, every muscle in her body still taut with readiness. Her pulse had slowed, but the tension hadn't left her. She knew the test was over, for now. But Viper wouldn't stop. Not yet. She returned to the house without turning on the lights, locking the door with a firm click before double-checking every window latch. The note from her windshield still sat on her kitchen counter, folded neatly beside her phone. "You should have stayed quiet." She couldn't shake the feeling that tonight's intrusion had been more than a scare tactic. Viper wasn't just trying to frighten her anymore. He was escalating, circling closer with every move. His pride had taken a hit, and men like him would do anything to restore that power. But there was something else bothering her. Skull's hesitation. The younger recruits' discomfort. They weren't committed to this anymore, not fully. They had acted out of obligation, not loyalty, and that fracture could be widened, but it meant nothing if Viper himself didn't break. Emily didn't sleep that night. The next morning, the tension lingered like a fog pressing against her mind. The sun was barely rising as she stood on her porch, sipping coffee, scanning the street for anything unusual. No motorcycles, no strange cars, but her instincts hadn't dulled. She knew what came next wouldn't be subtle. Sure enough, her phone vibrated on the counter, another blocked number. She let it ring twice before answering. Silence. Then a low, familiar voice. "Nice little speech you gave my boys last night." Viper. His voice was calm, but the forced control was obvious. She could hear the tension beneath it, the simmering rage he was trying to mask. Emily remained silent, giving him nothing. "You think you're some kind of hero, huh?" he continued. "Think you can humiliate me? You're playing a dangerous game, lady. You had your fun, but you're done. Tonight, it ends." Click. The line went dead. Emily set the phone down carefully, her mind already shifting into action. He's coming. And she would be ready. The day passed like a countdown. Emily stayed in control, keeping her routine as normal as possible but never truly letting her guard down. She visited the same grocery store, refueled her SUV at the same gas station, but everything was deliberate, calculated. She knew she was being watched, and she let them watch. By dusk, the tension had reached its peak. She had returned home, deliberately leaving her lights on, once again creating the illusion of routine. But this time, she was prepared for more than a visit. She was prepared for a siege. 11:45 p.m., the breaking point. The distant rumble of engines echoed down her street long before the bikes came into view. Emily had been waiting, crouched near the front window, her body low and controlled. She hadn't called the police, not yet. This wasn't a situation where the presence of authority would de-escalate anything. Viper had made this personal. The roar grew louder. Then they arrived. 4 bikes pulled up in perfect formation, their headlights illuminating the front of her home. The riders remained mounted, engines idling, the rumble like a growl vibrating through the quiet street. And then Viper dismounted. He approached alone, the headlights casting his shadow across her lawn as he stood there, hands at his sides, face pale but set with cold determination. His jacket was unzipped, the faint gleam of something tucked beneath it catching her eye. A blade! She didn't flinch. Viper raised his voice just enough for the whole street to hear. "Come out here, lady. Let's finish this." Emily remained still, heart steady. Don't react. Make him commit. But then he made his next mistake. "Or maybe I'll bring the fight to you," he shouted, taking a step toward her front porch. That was it. Emily opened the door. The suddenness of her appearance made the other bikers stiffen, their hands tightening on their handlebars. But Viper? His eyes narrowed. He was expecting defiance, but not calm. She stood there, framed by the light from inside her house, her arms at her sides, controlled, unshaken. "You came all the way here for this, Viper? Still trying to prove you're a threat?" His lip curled, voice hard. "You humiliated me, made me look weak. I told you, this ends tonight." Emily tilted her head, voice calm but cutting. "You made yourself look weak, Viper. I just didn't let you get away with it." His face flushed with anger, the tension in his body coiling tighter. Then his hand twitched toward his jacket. A heartbeat of silence. She saw it, before he even drew the blade. A shift in his balance, the intent in his eyes. And that was all she needed. In one fluid motion, Emily stepped forward, closing the gap before he could fully react. Her hand snapped out, seizing his wrist just as the blade cleared his jacket. A sharp twist, not enough to break, but enough to send searing pain up his arm. The blade clattered to the ground. Viper staggered back, his face twisted in shock. Emily didn't strike again. She didn't need to. She stared him down, voice steady. "You don't belong in control. You never did. Your men know it. You know it. And now, you've got nothing left." Behind him, Skull and the others remained frozen, watching. And as Viper looked back, he finally saw it. No one was moving to help him. They were watching their leader crumble. Viper's breath caught, and for the first time his voice faltered. You're making a mistake." "No, Viper," Emily interrupted, her voice unwavering. "You already made yours." He stumbled back, humiliated yet again, clutching his wrist as his men remained silent. Without a word, he retreated, mounting his bike. The others hesitated, sharing uncertain glances before following. Engines roared once more, but this time it wasn't intimidation. It was retreat. And as the sound faded into the night, Emily knew it was over. For good. The night air settled into a dense, eerie stillness long after the sound of the bikes had faded into the distance. Emily remained on her front porch, watching the empty street, her heartbeat steady but her mind still sharp with vigilance. The confrontation was over. Viper had retreated, humiliated, disarmed, and stripped of the power he once clung to so desperately, but it didn't feel finished. Not completely. The way Skull and the others had lingered, the silent hesitation in their eyes, it wasn't loyalty keeping them around, it was confusion. They weren't following Viper anymore. They were waiting for him to crumble entirely. Emily knew it was only a matter of time. Still, she didn't relax. Not fully. Not yet. She stepped back inside, locking the door behind her with a quiet click. The house felt too still, the soft hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock the only sounds filling the space. The adrenaline lingered, her mind replaying every move, every calculated step she had taken to keep control of the situation. She had won. But victories like this didn't always come clean. She knew how men like Viper operated. He had backed down because he was outnumbered, outmatched, but the core of his rage was still burning. Humiliation had a way of twisting into obsession. It wasn't over yet. The next morning, the sun broke early over the suburban skyline, but Emily had barely slept. She stood at the kitchen window, a mug of coffee untouched in her hands as she watched the street outside. The same quiet street, the same parked cars, but no sign of Viper. Not yet. The tension still clung to her, pressing on her chest like a weight she couldn't shake. Every instinct told her there was another move coming. Something deeper, more dangerous. And she was right. At 9:30 a.m., a white envelope appeared on her doorstep. No knock, no sound of footsteps. Just the envelope, stark against the wooden porch. Emily opened the door cautiously, scanning the street before picking it up. The handwriting was scrawled and uneven, but it was familiar. Viper. She unfolded the note with a growing sense of caution. "You're tough, lady, but this ain't over. Watch your back." No threats, no plans, just a warning. Or perhaps a challenge. She didn't hesitate. Minutes later, Emily was already moving. She didn't wait for Viper's next game. She didn't sit back, hoping it would blow over. That wasn't how you handled a threat like this. You controlled it. She drove straight to the industrial lot where she had confronted Viper the last time, scanning for signs of activity. Empty. No bikes, no movement. He's hiding. Her next stop was more direct. Skull's known hangout, a rundown dive bar on the edge of town. She didn't care about subtlety anymore. If Viper wasn't going to face her, she would make sure his men felt the pressure. The bar was quiet when she entered, the scent of stale beer hanging heavy in the air. A few patrons lingered at the back, but Skull was easy to spot, slouched in a corner booth, nursing a drink while staring blankly at the wall. He noticed her the moment she stepped in. The tension in his shoulders was immediate, but she didn't give him time to react. She crossed the room in controlled, measured strides, lowering her voice as she approached his table. "We need to talk." Skull's hand flexed around his glass. "Look, I told you. I'm out. I already—" "Stop," she cut him off. "I don't have time for excuses. Viper left this on my porch today. She tossed the crumpled note onto the table. Skull blinked, his expression tightening as he scanned the message. He's still pushing. He hasn't learned, and if he keeps pushing, someone's going to get hurt. Skull exhaled, leaning back in his chair, eyes narrowing. I didn't know he did this. We haven't seen him since you shut him down. Emily's gaze remained locked on his. That's not good enough. If you're really done following him, you need to make sure the rest of your crew is too. I don't want anyone else showing up at my house. Understand? He nodded slowly but remained quiet, as if weighing his next words. Finally, he spoke, softer. You were right about the fear. It's the only thing he's ever been good at, making people afraid. The guys, most of them were never loyal. They were just scared he'd turn on them next. Emily folded her arms. And now? Skull looked away, voice tight. Now? They're waiting, watching to see how this plays out, but some of them still think he's got power, that he's coming back. Emily's voice was calm but sharp. He's not. And if you let him pull you back in, you'll end up right where he wants you. Controlled. Skull nodded, quieter this time. I get it. But you should know. He's not thinking straight anymore. It's not just about you. He's losing it. Emily held his gaze. Then it's time someone made sure he doesn't lose control again. Without another word, she turned and walked out, leaving the crumpled note behind on the table. She wasn't running. She was closing in. The drive back from the bar was quiet, but Emily's mind churned with focused determination. Skull's words replayed in her head on a loop. He's not thinking straight anymore. He's losing it. Viper was unraveling. Humiliation had stripped him of the power he thrived on, and now he was desperate, clinging to whatever fragments of control remained. That made him unpredictable, dangerous, but also weak. The note on her porch had been a desperate move, not a calculated one. He wasn't sending a message. He was grasping for relevance, and it was time to shut him down, for good. As the sun dipped lower, casting streaks of orange across the sky, Emily returned home. She didn't feel the same tension she had the night before, but her instincts still told her it wasn't over. Not yet. After securing her windows and resetting the home security system, she sank onto the living room couch. Her breathing slowed, controlled, but her mind remained alert. Years of training wouldn't let her completely relax. Her phone vibrated. Unknown number. She answered without a word, listening carefully. Silence. And then, faint breathing. Emily didn't hang up. She let the silence stretch, waiting. Finally, a voice. Thought you were done with us, huh? Not Viper. Skull. But his voice was different now, strained. You need to listen to me, he continued, voice hushed like he didn't want to be overheard. It's worse than I thought. Viper's planning something and you're not going to like it. Emily's grip on the phone tightened. Talk. Skull hesitated, then exhaled sharply. He's calling everyone back. All of them. Not just the local guys. He wants to make a statement. You embarrassed him, and now he wants to finish it in front of the whole crew. Her voice was calm, but the tension behind it was palpable. When and where? Tomorrow, the warehouse, same spot as last time. Emily felt the shift. Viper wasn't just seeking revenge anymore. He wanted an audience. He wanted to reclaim his lost power by forcing a public confrontation. But he was making a critical mistake. He was giving her time to prepare. The next day arrived with the weight of finality pressing against Emily's chest. She had spent the morning mentally reviewing every possible angle, every move Viper could make. This wasn't just another attempt to intimidate her. It was a cornered man making his last stand. She wasn't going to let him win. By the afternoon, she was back at the industrial lot, parked in the same position where she had controlled the confrontation before. The space felt different now, more ominous. It wasn't long before the growl of engines broke the silence. 7 bikes this time. No more posturing. No scattered crew testing the waters. Viper was leading them directly. Emily stood her ground, centered in the open, arms loose at her sides as the gang slowed to a stop. The roar of their engines faded into an unnatural quiet as Viper dismounted. He looked worse than before. The bruising on his wrist had darkened, his face gaunt from whatever sleepless rage had consumed him since their last confrontation. But his eyes burned with something more dangerous than anger. Desperation. The rest of the gang stayed back this time, watching, hesitant. Skull was among them, his face tight with discomfort. Viper stepped forward, voice sharp and loud. "This ends today, lady. No tricks, no fancy speeches. You humiliated me. You think you're better than me. Stronger than me? Prove it, right here, right now." Emily didn't react to the challenge. Instead, her gaze swept the crowd. The bikers weren't standing with him. They were watching him. "You don't want to fight, Viper," she said calmly. "You want an audience. But they're not on your side anymore. Look around. They're not backing you up. They're just waiting to see how you fail next." Viper's face twisted, his fists clenching. "Shut up!" He lunged. But this time it wasn't a reckless charge. He was faster, sharper, fueled by anger but not completely out of control. His strike aimed for her center, a direct punch meant to break through her defenses. Emily countered. She deflected his wrist with a precise parry, pivoting to his side in a single smooth motion. Using his momentum against him, she hooked his arm, forcing him off balance and driving him toward the gravel. But she didn't slam him to the ground. She let him stagger back, humiliated. "Stop," she said, her voice a controlled command. Viper panted, stumbling, his face pale. He reached for his belt, a blade. Again. But this time, Emily moved faster. She closed the gap in a heartbeat, catching his wrist mid-draw and twisting it downward. The knife hit the ground with a metallic clang. Viper fell to his knees, gasping, wrist locked painfully in her grip. "This is your last chance," Emily whispered, voice deadly calm. "You keep coming for me, and next time, you won't get back up." The silence stretched, every eye in the gang locked on their leader, powerless beneath her hold. Viper's face twisted, but he wasn't just angry anymore. He was defeated. When she released his wrist, he collapsed fully to the ground. Emily stepped back, turning to the crew. "Look at him. Is this the man you're following? A bully who uses fear to stay in control? It's over. Walk away. All of you." There was no hesitation this time. Skull was the first to turn. Then the others followed, one by one, until Viper was alone, kneeling in the dirt, broken in every way that mattered. And this time, Emily knew. It was over. The sound of Viper's breathing was the only thing breaking the silence of the industrial lot. His crew had turned their backs on him, the rumble of engines fading in the distance as they left him alone in the dirt. Emily remained standing a few feet away, her posture unyielding, gaze locked on the man who had once ruled this group through fear. Viper stayed kneeling, his body heaving as he clutched his wrist. The pain wasn't from the hold she had used on him. It was the realization of everything crumbling around him. His power, his influence, his illusion of control, all shattered in front of the very men he had tried to intimidate her for. He wouldn't meet her eyes. Not yet. He was a broken man trying to process a defeat he had never prepared for. Emily stayed quiet, watching him. She knew better than to lower her guard just yet. Humiliation didn't always end in surrender. Sometimes it sparked something darker. And Viper was unpredictable now, his pride bleeding out faster than his physical wounds. She could see it in the tension still lingering in his body, the rage simmering beneath the surface, the urge to lash out one more time. He finally looked up. "You think this makes you better than me?" His voice was hoarse, bitter, but hollow. His words were meant to sting, but they carried none of the venom he once had. "You don't get it. You just made things worse for yourself. You humiliated me in front of them. And you think they'll forget?" Emily took a step closer, her shadow falling over him, but she remained calm. "They won't forget. But not for the reasons you think, Viper. They didn't leave because of what I did. They left because of what you became." He spat on the ground, shaking his head as if trying to hold on to the last scraps of defiance. "You don't know anything about loyalty, about brotherhood. They were mine." "They were scared of you," she corrected, voice calm but cutting. "Fear isn't loyalty. It was never about respect. It was about power, and you lost it the moment you stopped leading and started controlling. Now, they're finally seeing the truth. You were never the strongest. You were just loudest." Viper's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists, but he didn't rise. His breath was ragged, the fight draining from him in slow, agonizing waves. Emily knew this was the breaking point, the moment where men either chose to change or spiral deeper into the void. She knelt slightly, lowering herself to his eye level, voice softer but just as firm. "You need to hear this, Viper. It's over. Let it go. Because if you don't, it's not me you need to be afraid of anymore. It's what you'll do to yourself. The crew's already walking away. If you try to hold on, it'll only drag you deeper. And this? It'll be your legacy. The man who couldn't stop himself from self-destructing." Viper stared at the ground, his shoulders trembling with the weight of everything sinking in. For a moment, it seemed like he might respond. His lips parted, his chest rising as if preparing to speak. But then he slumped further, head hanging low, the fight truly leaving him. Emily exhaled slowly. This wasn't victory. Not really. It wasn't a triumphant moment, but a necessary one. Viper wasn't conquered, he was undone. And while she knew this was the end of his reign over his crew, it wasn't the kind of end that felt satisfying. She rose to her feet, backing away carefully, never fully turning her back until she reached her vehicle. Her instincts stayed sharp, half expecting him to lash out one last time. But he didn't move. He just stayed there, silent, broken, defeated. She climbed into her SUV, the sound of the door closing echoing louder than it should have in the vast emptiness. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as she sat there for a moment, staring through the windshield at the crumpled figure in the distance. Part of her felt sympathy. The other part knew that some men could only learn through consequences. As she drove away, the industrial lot growing smaller in her rearview mirror, Emily felt the tension finally begin to ease. The threat was over. Viper was done. His grip shattered, but a quiet voice lingered in the back of her mind. Was it really over? Or had she just delayed the inevitable? She pushed the thought aside, focusing on the road ahead. For now, she had done everything she could, and if the past had taught her anything, she was prepared for whatever came next. The drive home felt longer than it should have. The adrenaline had begun to fade, leaving a quiet heaviness settling into Emily's chest. The confrontation with Viper replayed in fragments behind her eyes, the moment his men turned against him, the look of desperation in his face, the way his body crumpled when he finally realized he had lost. But there was no satisfaction. Even as the industrial lot disappeared behind her, that lingering tension refused to fade completely. She had neutralized the immediate threat, dismantled his authority piece by piece, but the way he'd looked at her when she'd spoken, there had been something else behind his anger. Resentment. Resentment didn't dissolve easily. It festered. By the time Emily pulled into her driveway, the last light of the evening had bled from the sky, leaving the neighborhood in shadow. The street was quiet, the kind of suburban silence that felt deceptive after the chaos she had just left behind. But she didn't let her guard drop. Parking strategically with a full view of her street, she scanned the area carefully before exiting the vehicle. No unfamiliar cars, no signs of movement. Yet her instincts kept whispering. She knew better than to ignore them. After locking her door, Emily walked the perimeter of her home, checking every window, every latch, and every point of entry with quiet precision. It wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. Viper had backed down, but his ego was wounded, and wounded men didn't always stay rational. Finally satisfied, she returned inside, double-checking her security system before settling into the silence. The house felt too quiet tonight, too still. She brewed a cup of coffee, the scent familiar, grounding, but even as she sat at her kitchen table, the feeling wouldn't leave. It wasn't fear. It was unfinished business. She reached for her phone, flipping it open and scrolling through her recent calls. Skull's number was still saved from their previous encounter, though she hadn't expected to use it again. Tonight, though, she had questions. After a brief hesitation, she pressed call. The line rang twice before he picked up, his voice wary. "Yeah?" "It's Emily." Silence on the other end, then a sharp breath. "Listen, if this is about last night—" "It's not." Her voice was calm but firm. "I need to know if he's really done, Skull. You were there. You saw him break. But I've seen men like him before. This doesn't feel finished." Skull was quiet for a long moment before replying, voice lower than before. "He's broken, but he's not done. Not yet. He lost the crew, sure, but he's still blaming you. Said you ruined everything, that you made him look weak." Emily closed her eyes briefly, exhaling through her nose. "It's not over." "Do you know where he is now?" she asked quietly. Another pause. Then Skull exhaled, sounding conflicted. "No. He disappeared after you left. Didn't say a word. But listen. He's not thinking straight. I don't think he's done with you, but I also don't think he's got anyone left to back him. Whatever he does next, it'll be desperate." Desperate was dangerous. Emily thanked him and hung up, her mind already piecing together possibilities. Viper had been stripped of his influence, his crew, his reputation. And yet some men didn't need an army to create destruction. Some acted out of pure personal vengeance, and that was what worried her the most. She sat in silence for a long while after the call ended, her gaze fixed on the window where faint moonlight spilled across her lawn. Her instincts had been right from the start. This wasn't over. Not yet. But she would be ready when he came. The next morning broke with a dull, gray sky. Emily felt the weight of exhaustion pressing heavier than before, but there was no room for weakness. She trained herself to remain sharp, to stay prepared. Even when nothing seemed immediate, the threat hadn't vanished. The morning passed quietly. No phone calls, no strange vehicles, just the steady rhythm of normal life continuing outside her walls, until she opened her front door. There, lying neatly folded on her welcome mat, was another message. A plain, white piece of paper, carefully creased. Emily's heart slowed as she crouched to retrieve it, already feeling the cold certainty in her chest. The handwriting was different this time. Neater, more calculated. "I have nothing left, so you have nothing left to lose either. See you soon." She read the words twice, pulse steady but cold. This wasn't the same posturing as before. It wasn't about control. This was personal, and she knew what was coming next. The final confrontation. The message sat heavy in her hands, its weight far greater than the paper it was written on. Viper had crossed a threshold. The threats weren't posturing anymore. This wasn't about intimidation. The words were final, desperate. "I have nothing left." That was what made men like him most dangerous. The morning light felt colder as it streamed through the window. The house, though secure, felt like it had become part of the battlefield. Every locked door, every security measure, it wasn't enough to shake the unease pressing into her chest. Emily folded the note carefully, setting it down beside her phone. This was no longer just a test of dominance. Viper's message was personal. His pride had been shattered, and now he was spiraling. But it wasn't fear Emily felt. It was clarity. She needed to finish this. The day moved in slow motion. Emily kept her movements deliberate, calculated. She avoided her usual routines, changing the time she left for errands, varying her driving routes. There was no sign of Viper, but she could feel it. He was out there, watching, waiting. As the sun dipped lower, Emily sat at the kitchen table tracing the words of his note with her fingertips. She considered every angle, every possibility. Viper wouldn't let this end quietly. He was too far gone for that. And then, just as dusk settled, her phone rang. No caller ID. She let it ring twice before answering. "Emily." A pause, then his voice. "I gave you a chance." Viper's voice was different now. Hollow, strained. The arrogant bravado stripped away, replaced by something darker. Resentment curdled into obsession. "You took everything from me," he continued, breathing ragged through the line. "You couldn't just leave it alone. You had to break me in front of my own people. Now you're going to find out what it's like to lose." She remained silent, letting the words spill out, unchallenged. Let him burn himself out. "I know where you live," he growled, voice trembling. "I know how you think. I've been watching. And when I come for you, you won't see it coming." She finally spoke, her voice calm as steel. "You already lost, Viper. All you're proving now is that you have nothing left." Silence. Then the call ended with a hard click. But she knew. This wasn't the end of his threats. It was the beginning of his final move. Later, that night. The wind howled softly outside her home, brushing against the windows like a whisper. Emily sat in darkness, the only light coming from the dim glow of the security monitors on her wall. 4 cameras, 4 angles, the street, the driveway, the back fence, the front door, all clear, but she stayed vigilant. The patterns were wrong tonight. The street was too quiet, no passing cars, no distant dog barks. Stillness was unnatural in a neighborhood like this. And then, at precisely 2:13 a.m., a shadow crossed the farthest edge of the driveway camera. Not a figure, just movement. Emily's pulse didn't spike. She remained calm, leaning forward in her chair, eyes narrowing. The shape lingered near the edge of the screen, too cautious to step into full view, testing the perimeter. She rose slowly, moving to the window, her body a silhouette in the darkness. Through the blinds, she scanned the street. Empty. But the unease tightened. Viper was there. She knew it. And then a faint metallic click outside. The side gate. Emily moved with practiced silence, retrieving the tactical flashlight from the drawer and slipping it into her grip. She didn't call for help. She was the help. The back door. A shadow loomed, the sound of footsteps pressing against the gravel just beyond the fence. She didn't wait. She stepped out. The beam of her flashlight snapped on, cutting through the darkness. "Stop right there." The figure froze. Viper. But something was wrong. His face was pale, gaunt. He wasn't armed. His clothes were soaked from the light drizzle outside, and his eyes were bloodshot, sunken. "You're not supposed to be this calm," he muttered, voice cracking. Emily didn't lower the light. "I warned you," she said quietly. "This ends now, Viper. Walk away. You have nothing to gain here." He staggered forward, hands trembling. "I lost everything because of you. I was respected, feared." "No," she replied, voice unwavering. "You were feared, not respected. And fear doesn't last. It never does." His fists clenched, but his body sagged, the weight of his defeat pressing heavier than his threats. He wasn't here for revenge anymore. He was here because he was broken. "Don't make me call the police, Viper," she warned. "You don't want to spend the rest of your life running from this. You can still stop." For the first time, his eyes softened, just slightly. But then the tension snapped. With a ragged growl, Viper lunged, desperation fueling his final, clumsy attempt to reclaim power. Emily didn't hesitate. She sidestepped, sweeping his arm with a sharp twist, the same precision she had used before. His knee buckled. He hit the ground hard, wind knocked from his chest. This time she didn't let him rise. She knelt, pinning his arm in a controlled hold, voice firm but steady. "This is over. You're not a leader anymore. You're a threat to yourself. And now you'll answer for it." She held him there, waiting for him to finally break. And as the wail of distant sirens echoed through the quiet night, she felt it. The fight was gone. Completely. The wail of the sirens grew louder, the flashing red and blue lights slicing through the night as they reflected off the wet pavement. Emily remained kneeling beside Viper, her grip unyielding but controlled. His chest heaved beneath her pin, his body slack now, the fight drained completely from his trembling frame. For the first time since this conflict began, he wasn't snarling, wasn't posturing. He was just empty. The engine of the first squad car cut out as two officers emerged, moving with caution as their flashlights swept the yard. Emily raised her hand calmly, her voice steady as she spoke. "He's restrained. Unarmed now. The knife's over there." The officers approached carefully, assessing the scene before one of them. A broad-shouldered man with a stern expression nodded. "Step back, ma'am. We'll take it from here." Emily released Viper's wrist carefully, standing and backing away as the officers moved in, securing his hands with a set of cuffs. He didn't resist. He didn't even speak. His head hung low, water dripping from his rain-soaked clothes as the officer read him his rights. She watched, arms crossed, her heartbeat finally slowing as the threat truly ended. But it didn't feel like triumph. It felt quiet. As the officers loaded Viper into the back of the cruiser, one of them approached Emily again. "Ma'am, we're going to need a full statement. Do you want to come down to the station, or can we take it here?" Emily nodded, voice calm but distant. "I'll give my statement now. He's been harassing me for days. This wasn't his first attempt." The officer scribbled into his notepad, glancing up occasionally. "You handled yourself well tonight. But I have to ask, why didn't you call us sooner? If he'd been stalking you, we could have stepped in before it came to this." Her gaze remained steady. "He needed to be stopped, and some threats don't go away just because you call the police." The officer hesitated but nodded, recognizing the truth in her words. Still, it wasn't protocol. "Understood. We'll keep you informed on the charges. Based on the evidence here, trespassing, harassment, and attempted assault. It's looking serious." She nodded once, though her mind was elsewhere. Viper's eyes, the way they had shifted from fury to emptiness in the final moments. Men like him never started as monsters. They became them, layer by layer, through unchecked anger and misplaced control. And she had peeled every layer back tonight. But it wasn't her job to fix that. The next morning was gray, rain misting against the windows as Emily sat quietly at her kitchen table. The storm had passed, but the weight of everything lingered. She had barely slept, the adrenaline having long since worn off, leaving only exhaustion. Her phone buzzed. A text message. "Skull. I heard. He's done, huh?" Emily exhaled slowly, replying. Emily. "Yeah, it's over." Skull. "Guess we all knew it would end this way." He couldn't let go. Not really. She hesitated, staring at the screen for a long moment before typing back. Emily. "You don't have to follow his path. You made the right choice when you walked away. So did the others. Remember that." The message sent. No response. Not yet. But she felt it. The ripple effect. Viper's collapse wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the toxic influence he'd held over everyone who followed him, the way fear had controlled their lives. Now, with him gone, there was a chance, however small, that some of them could break free too. She wasn't naive. Not all of them would. But Skull? Maybe. Later that afternoon, a knock sounded at the door. Emily approached carefully, glancing through the peephole first. It wasn't Skull. It was the young father from the gas station, the same man she'd defended at the very start of all this. He looked nervous, his hands fidgeting as he held something folded in his hands. She opened the door. "Hi," he said awkwardly. I don't know if you remember me, but you stopped those guys at the Costco station." "I remember," she said softly. "How are you and your family?" The man smiled, though it was small. "We're okay. Better now. I saw the news. They arrested him, right? The leader?" She nodded. "I just wanted to say thank you. I should have said it before. I should have done something back then, but I was scared. I froze. And you—" His voice faltered, emotion thickening it. "You didn't have to step in. But you did." Emily's expression softened, her own tension finally easing as she replied. "You don't have to explain yourself. Fear's normal. Standing up to it? That's hard. And you protected your family. That's what matters." The man exhaled deeply, nodding before unfolding the paper he held. It was a handwritten note. Thank you for standing up for those who couldn't. She didn't need recognition, but it felt different. Good. As he turned to leave, Emily closed the door gently behind him, holding the note in her hands a moment longer before placing it beside Viper's crumpled message. The last trace of his influence now reduced to nothing more than words on a page. The threat was gone, and peace at last had returned. The rain returned that evening, a soft drizzle whispering against the windows as the weight of the past week began to settle fully over Emily's mind. The confrontation, the threats, the final breakdown, all of it felt distant now, yet the echoes still lingered in her chest. The quiet was both welcome and unnerving, a void where tension had once lived. The note from the young father remained on her kitchen counter, the handwriting delicate and sincere. She had read it several times, not out of pride, but reflection. Standing up for others wasn't new to her. It was part of who she was. But something about this felt different. The battle hadn't been on a distant battlefield this time. It had been personal, close, and it made her wonder if she could ever truly leave conflict behind. The thought was interrupted by the vibration of her phone. She expected another follow-up from the officers, case updates, maybe Skull reaching out again. But it wasn't either. It was an unknown number. She hesitated for a moment before answering. A familiar voice echoed on the other end. "Skull. Emily, I didn't know if I should call, but look, I need to tell you something." His voice was strained, quieter than before. Not defensive, not angry, almost uncertain. She kept her voice calm. "Go ahead." There was a pause. Then, "Some of the guys, they're talking about leaving for good. The crew's done. Viper had us wrapped so tight around his ego we never thought about what came next. Now they're scared, but not of you, of what happens after. Some of them don't know how to walk away from this life." Emily exhaled slowly, her grip on the phone tightening. "Skull, you don't owe that life anything. None of you do. Fear doesn't keep people together, it keeps them trapped, but it only holds as long as you let it." His voice dropped lower. "Yeah, but you saw what he did. He nearly tore himself apart trying to hold on to control. What if someone else tries to take his place?" That was the truth of fractured groups like Viper's. Power vacuums. Someone weaker would try to reclaim it, mistaking violence for leadership. But Emily knew there was a choice. "Then you have a decision to make," she said softly but firmly. "You can either wait for the next Viper to step in, or you can walk away now. Take the others with you before someone worse steps in. Don't wait for it to get worse." Silence hung heavy between them. Then a slow exhale. "I'll think about it," Skull muttered. "But you should know. Some of the guys still blame you. They're scared, yeah, but not all of them are ready to let go. Emily nodded, already knowing what that meant. Fear didn't break easily. Some would cling to it, trying to rebuild the chaos just to feel a sense of power again. I understand, she replied quietly, but if they come looking for trouble, they'll find the same result. Skull didn't argue. I'll keep you updated, he finished before the call ended. The next morning, the skies had cleared, sunlight breaking through the pale clouds as Emily stood in her driveway, arms crossed, scanning the quiet street. No motorcycles, no threats. But that conversation lingered in her mind. Viper had fallen, but that didn't mean the fight was over. Some threats didn't die. They lingered, changed faces, changed names, but the mentality remained. She knew she couldn't protect everyone. But she had set a standard. And if anyone came back seeking to test that boundary, they would meet the same unwavering strength. But for now, for the first time in days, the quiet felt like peace. And she would hold on to it as long as she could. The sun lingered low in the sky as the day wound to a close, golden light stretching long shadows across the quiet suburban street. The calm felt heavier now, as if the storm that had been circling finally dispersed. But Emily knew better than to fully exhale. The scars left by men like Viper didn't fade overnight. Her mind drifted back to the call with Skull. His words echoed like a warning. Not all of them are ready to let go. It was true. The kind of fear Viper had used to control his crew wasn't built overnight, and it wouldn't dissolve just because he had been taken down. Some of the men had already begun moving on, but others. They would see his defeat as a void waiting to be filled, and voids like that attracted danger. Still, Emily refused to live in paranoia. Caution, yes. Preparation, always. But fear? That was what Viper had thrived on. She wouldn't let it infect her too. The evening passed without incident. No calls, no unknown cars lingering near the house, no distant rumble of motorcycle engines. But just before midnight, a sound pulled her from a light sleep. Not loud. A quiet scrape near the back of the house. Instantly, she was awake, moving without sound as she reached for the tactical flashlight on her nightstand. She pressed her back to the wall near the window, listening. Another noise. Faint, deliberate. Someone was there. Emily's breathing slowed, her pulse steady. She wasn't afraid, but she was ready. Barefoot, she moved through the darkened house, every step silent as she approached the back door. She didn't turn on any lights. She wanted to stay unseen. Through the window, she could barely make out the shadowed figure near the back fence. Tall, broad, trying to stay out of the view of the cameras. But they had already made a mistake. Emily had adjusted the angles after Viper's last intrusion. They were fully visible from her kitchen feed. She opened the security app on her phone, zooming in on the live footage. Not Viper, but familiar. The younger biker. The recruit who had hesitated that night at the industrial lot. The one who had looked unsure. And now, here he was. Alone. She moved swiftly to the door, unlocking it with a deliberate click loud enough for him to hear. The figure froze. "Don't move," Emily said, voice calm but commanding. The young man turned slowly, both hands raised. No weapon, no sign of aggression. But his face wasn't confident either. He looked lost. "Please," he started, voice cracking. "I'm not here to fight." Emily narrowed her eyes but didn't lower her guard. "Then why are you here?" The recruit swallowed hard, stepping back from the fence, keeping his hands visible. "I needed to talk, to explain." She watched him closely, searching for deception, but there was only exhaustion in his expression. She didn't speak, letting the silence work against him. Finally, he caved. "I didn't sign up for this," he muttered. "Viper promised it was just brotherhood. A crew. He said we were a family, but it wasn't. It never was. And now?" His voice broke. Now I don't know what to do. The others, they're talking. Some still want to pick up where he left off. But not me. I'm done. Emily's grip on the flashlight relaxed just slightly, but she remained cautious. "Why come here?" she asked, her voice softer but still guarded. He exhaled shakily. "Because you're the only one who stood up to him. You showed me that strength isn't fear, and I need to get out before they try to pull me back in." The vulnerability was genuine, but trust wasn't something Emily gave freely. "What do you expect from me?" she asked. He hesitated. "I need to leave, to get away from all of this, but they're watching me. Skull told me you helped him see things clearly. I was hoping maybe you could help me too." Emily stayed silent for a long moment. This was a risk. Bringing a fractured recruit like him into her space was dangerous. But she could see the truth in his face. He wasn't here as a threat. He was a kid caught in the wreckage of someone else's destruction, and if she turned him away, the cycle would continue. Finally, she spoke. "I'm not here to save you," she said quietly, "but I can give you advice. If you want to break free from that life, you need to cut all ties, all of them, and you need to do it now before they decide you're next." The young man nodded, visibly shaken but understanding. "Thank you," he whispered. "I didn't know who else to turn to." She watched as he backed away, retreating into the shadows. But Emily knew this wasn't the end. This was the beginning of the next chapter, a battle against something bigger than just Viper, and she would be ready for whatever came next. The young recruit disappeared into the shadows, his footsteps fading quietly into the damp earth beyond the fence. Emily remained standing at the back door long after he was gone, her pulse steady but her mind far from calm. The weight of his words lingered. "They're watching me. Some of them still want to pick up where he left off." Viper was gone, arrested, defeated, but his influence hadn't fully died, it had only fractured, and fractures left cracks where weaker, hungrier men could slip in and try to reclaim power. She exhaled, locking the door with a deliberate click, ensuring every point of entry was secured before returning to her kitchen. The note from Skull still sat beside the young father's message, both reminders of what she had endured over the past days. But the recruit's visit had changed something. This wasn't over. Not yet. The following morning, the rain had finally cleared, leaving the air crisp and sharp under a pale winter sky. Emily sipped her coffee in silence, watching the sun break gently over the rooftops. Her phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. She let it ring 3 times, then answered, voice calm. "Emily." A voice she recognized instantly. Skull. "Something's happening," he muttered, voice tense. "That recruit, the kid who came to you last night, he's in trouble." Emily's spine straightened. "What kind of trouble?" Skull hesitated. "I don't know everything yet, but a couple of the guys, ones who didn't leave after Viper went down, they're saying he turned on the crew. They think he talked to you." "He did," Emily said bluntly. "But he didn't betray anyone. He's scared." Skull exhaled. "They don't see it that way. Word's spreading that he backed out after your talk. Some of the younger guys are trying to prove themselves. They're talking retaliation." Retaliation? Her jaw tightened. Viper had planted the seed, and now the remnants were trying to restore the chaos he left behind. "Where is he?" she asked, already moving toward her gear bag. "Trying to get out of town," Skull replied, voice lower. "But they're following him. If they catch him, I don't know if I can stop it this time." Emily's response was immediate. "Send me the location." 15 minutes later, Emily's SUV cut through the quiet backroads on the edge of town, the recruit's location blinking on her phone's map. Skull had sent a pin, an old service station on the outskirts, the kind of place far from prying eyes, perfect for intimidation. Or worse. Her pulse remained steady, her focus razor-sharp as the road narrowed, the station coming into view in the distance. Faded signs, broken windows, a place where no one would hear an altercation. And there they were. 2 bikes, the young recruit's car pinned against the edge of the cracked pavement. The bikers stood on either side, circling him. No helmets this time, just exposed, angry faces. Emily pulled in without hesitation, the crunch of her tires loud in the silence. She didn't rush, didn't slam the door. Control. She exited the vehicle standing tall but calm, her gaze sweeping the situation. The recruit was pale, his hands raised, visibly trembling as the 2 men flanked him. One of the bikers, broad shoulders, a thick beard, a face she recognized from Viper's crew, was speaking low, threatening. But her presence changed everything. The bearded man noticed her immediately, his face twisting in irritation. "This ain't your fight," he growled, stepping forward as if to block her view of the recruit. Emily held his gaze, her voice even. "It became my fight the second you brought it here. Back off." The second man, thinner but wiry, sneered. "He turned his back on us. Loyalty's not optional." Emily's stare didn't waver. "This isn't loyalty. This is bullying. And I've already dealt with your last leader. Do you really want to end up where he did?" Silence. The bearded man's fists clenched, his body shifting with tension. But it wasn't strength. It was hesitation. They were holding on to Viper's legacy because they had nothing else, and she was about to take it all from them. "He didn't turn on you," Emily continued, stepping closer, voice unwavering. "He woke up. You're all clinging to a man who abandoned you. Viper lost. He was arrested. Gone. You're chasing a ghost, and it's going to get you hurt." The second man spat on the ground. "You talk tough, lady, but there's 2 of us and 1 of you." Emily's eyes narrowed, her stance shifting subtly. 2 against 1, she said, voice icy. "You really think that's going to make a difference?" The bearded man stepped closer, but there was uncertainty in his eyes now. She could see it, the same crack she'd seen in Skull before. They weren't fighters, they were scared. "Leave him alone," she finished, gesturing toward the recruit. "He's done with you. Let him go, or I will end this, right here, right now." Silence pressed down hard. The bearded man hesitated, then finally stepped back. The wiry one hesitated longer, but seeing his partner retreat forced his hand. They didn't apologize, but they left. Engines rumbled back to life, and within moments they were gone, the dust settling as the road returned to quiet. Emily turned to the recruit, who was visibly shaking. "Are you hurt?" He shook his head, struggling to speak. I didn't know who else." "You're safe now," she interrupted gently. "But you need to leave town. Tonight. They'll keep trying to prove themselves until they have nothing left." He nodded weakly, the gravity of her words sinking in. She watched him drive away minutes later, his car disappearing into the distance. And as Emily stood alone in the empty lot, she knew this fight wasn't just about men like Viper anymore. It was about stopping the cycle, one confrontation at a time. The recruit's taillights faded into the horizon, leaving the cracked asphalt of the old service station bathed in dim twilight. Emily remained standing there for a moment, letting the silence settle. The 2 bikers were gone, their engines nothing more than a faint memory in the distance. For now, the confrontation had ended without violence, but the weight in her chest remained. This wasn't victory. It felt more like a delay. She could sense it. This entire situation was teetering on the edge of something darker. The cracks in Viper's influence were still there, but the ones who hadn't yet let go were growing desperate. They were clinging not to leadership, but to the last fragments of control Viper had wielded over them. And desperation always led to recklessness. The drive home was quiet, the hum of the tires the only sound as the sun dipped fully below the horizon. Darkness stretched long across the streets, and yet Emily's awareness never dulled. Her eyes flicked to the rearview mirror more often than usual, scanning for anything out of place. No headlights followed, no sign of the bikers. But the tension stayed. It wasn't fear, it was instinct. By the time she pulled into her driveway, the rain had begun again, light droplets whispering against the hood of her SUV. She left the vehicle running for a moment, scanning the street, waiting, listening. Nothing. Finally, she shut the engine off and stepped out, closing the door gently behind her. But the silence felt wrong. Too heavy. Her pulse slowed, focus narrowing as she moved toward her front door. The porch light flickered weakly overhead, casting faint shadows against the wet pavement. And then, a sound. Not loud. A faint scrape along the side of the house. Emily froze, every muscle coiling tight as she reached for the tactical flashlight tucked beneath her jacket. She didn't speak, didn't call out, control the situation. The noise came again, closer this time. A shuffle. Someone was there. Without hesitation, she circled around the side of the house, the beam of her flashlight slicing cleanly through the shadows. The figure emerged from the darkness just as she expected. Skull. But he wasn't alone. A second figure lingered just behind him. Not a threat. The recruit. Both men raised their hands slightly, Skull's expression tense but not aggressive. The recruit looked pale, soaked from the rain, his face drawn with exhaustion. Emily lowered the beam but didn't relax. Talk. Skull shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the recruit before speaking. I had to bring him back. He hesitated. He's scared, and they're not letting this go. Some of the guys are talking about making a move. Tonight. Emily's stomach tightened, but her face remained unreadable. Who? Skull shook his head. Not the whole crew. Just two of them. Trigger-happy. The ones who think you made us weak by taking Viper down. They think if they handle you, they'll take the power back. I tried to shut it down, but... He paused, frustration flashing across his face. They're not listening anymore. They want to prove something. Emily nodded slowly, piecing it together. It wasn't about leadership anymore. It was about revenge. Ego. And that made them dangerous. Where are they now? She asked quietly. Skull hesitated, then shook his head. Don't know, but it feels like they're circling, watching. Her jaw tightened. I need you both inside. Now. Minutes later, the three of them sat in the dim light of her kitchen, rain tapping softly against the windows. Skull sat with his arms crossed, tense but cooperative. The recruit hadn't spoken much, too shaken to contribute. Emily paced, her mind working through the options. They're testing me, she said aloud, more for herself than anyone else. This isn't organized. It's chaos. But it only takes one mistake for someone to get hurt. Skull nodded grimly. They're not thinking straight. They feel like they have something to prove. Emily's voice sharpened. They don't, and they're not leaving here with that illusion. A knock interrupted her words. A single, heavy knock against the front door. The tension in the room shifted instantly. The recruit flinched, his breath catching in his throat. Skull's hand instinctively rested near his belt, though he was unarmed. Emily moved first. She approached the door without hesitation, glancing through the peephole. Two figures, leather vests, faces half hidden by rain and shadow. She knew them. The same two who had confronted the recruit earlier. They weren't just testing boundaries anymore. They were here for a fight. Emily unlocked the door but didn't open it fully. She stood in the narrow gap, one hand on the doorframe, the other resting lightly on her hip where the tactical light remained clipped. The taller of the two men spoke first, his voice low, dripping with forced bravado. We're here to talk. Emily's gaze didn't waver. You already did, at the service station. Or did you forget how that ended? The second man, thinner, more agitated, stepped forward. "You humiliated us. You made us look weak. Viper would never have let that slide." Emily's voice dropped. "Viper isn't here anymore." The taller man sneered. "And whose fault is that?" Emily held his gaze, steady, calm. "He did that to himself, just like you're about to if you don't leave." The thin man's lip curled. "You're bluffing. We outnumber you. What are you going to do? Call the cops?" Emily's expression never changed. "No." She opened the door wider, just enough for them to see Skull and the recruit sitting inside. The sight clearly rattled them. The unity. The fact Skull was no longer on their side. "This ends tonight," Emily said, voice like steel. "You have two choices. Leave or escalate and face the same result Viper did." The taller man blinked, uncertain. The younger one shifted his weight as if considering a move. But the truth was clear. They had lost before they even arrived. Without another word, they turned. The rain swallowed the sound of their retreat, and when the door closed, Emily felt it. The final fracture. Viper's grip was truly broken. The rain had slowed to a light drizzle, misting against the windows as Emily stood with her back to the door, listening to the sound of the two bikers retreating into the night. The echo of their boots on wet pavement lingered longer than it should have. But they were gone. For now. She remained silent, pulse steady but shoulders still coiled with tension. Skull and the recruit sat in the kitchen, watching her with mirrored expressions of disbelief. The confrontation had been brief, controlled, but its impact echoed far beyond the exchange. Emily finally spoke, her voice quiet but commanding. "That was the last warning they get." The recruit, pale and shaken, nodded rapidly, his hands clasped tightly on the table as if trying to ground himself. Skull, however, looked different, resigned. "They're not coming back," he muttered. Emily's eyes narrowed. "They left because they saw you, because they saw hesitation, not because they learned anything." Skull's jaw clenched, his arms folding tightly across his chest. "They're done. You broke them, Emily. Viper's gone. The crew's gone. What else do you want from me?" Her voice stayed calm, but the steel beneath it sharpened. "I want you to finish it, Skull. You're still holding on, even now. You're waiting for someone else to take control of the mess Viper left behind. But leadership isn't about intimidation. It's about decisions. You have one to make." Silence. The rain outside grew softer, almost whispering now, but the weight between them only deepened. The recruit finally spoke, voice hoarse. "She's right. It's over, man. We followed the wrong person, and I don't want to go back to that. None of us should." Skull didn't argue, but he didn't agree either. He looked away, the conflict playing visibly across his face, the last shards of the loyalty he had clung to fighting against the reality before him. Emily watched it happen. She recognized the battle playing out behind his eyes. It was the same battle she had seen in men before, the fight between ego and growth. Finally, Skull exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face. His voice was low but steady. "I'm done. For real this time." The words weren't loud, but they were true. Emily nodded once, satisfied but not relaxed. "Then you need to walk away, for good. No halfway out. If you leave those guys behind, you leave. No checking back in, no calling them up, no defending them when they crash and burn." Skull nodded slowly, the weight of the decision sinking in fully. "Yeah, I get it." The next morning, the rain had cleared, leaving the air cool and damp as sunlight broke through the thinning clouds. Emily stood at her kitchen window watching the street as the morning fog lifted. It felt still. No bikes, no strange figures lingering. Quiet. But this time, it felt genuine. A deep, long breath left her lungs as she watched Skull's truck pull away from the curb, the recruit in the passenger seat beside him. They were leaving together. No words needed. She didn't wave, didn't need to. They had made their choice, the right one, and for the first time in weeks the tension that had wrapped around her chest began to loosen. The fight was over. For real this time. But as she watched the street return to normal, she reminded herself of the truth she had always known. There would always be another fight, another threat. But when it came, she would be ready. The days passed quietly. The tension that had once gripped the neighborhood seemed to dissolve with each sunrise, leaving behind a stillness Emily hadn't felt in weeks. No lingering motorcycles, no unknown faces hovering on the edges of her vision. Just peace, at least for now. She moved through her routines with cautious optimism, double-checking the locks out of habit rather than necessity. The weight in her chest had lessened, though not entirely. Some instincts never fully rested. But it wasn't fear. It was vigilance. Skull and the recruit had left town without further incident, a final message sent from Skull confirming they were headed far enough away to start over. Clean. Emily hadn't responded. There was nothing left to say. They had made their choice, and as far as she was concerned, they had earned their chance to rebuild. Still, the quiet didn't feel permanent. Viper's influence had cracked, shattered even, but Emily knew something most people never truly understood. Violence didn't vanish. It waited. Late one evening, just as the sun dipped beneath the horizon, a familiar knock echoed against her front door. 3 slow taps. Deliberate. Emily's heartbeat slowed, not from fear, but focus. She approached the door carefully, her hand resting lightly on the lock as she peered through the peephole. A police officer. Not the same one who had been there the night Viper was taken into custody. This one was older, grayer around the temples with a calm but professional expression. She opened the door slightly, keeping her posture firm. "Ma'am," the officer began, his voice steady. "I'm Lieutenant Reeves. I need to speak with you about the recent incidents involving Gregory Rains." "Viper?" She nodded, stepping aside as he entered, his eyes scanning the room with quiet assessment. He didn't seem hostile, but there was a tension in his voice. "Rains was released this morning," Reeves said, his words measured. The room seemed to shrink slightly, the quiet pressing heavier around them. Emily's face remained neutral, but the slow tightening of her jaw was enough to show she understood the gravity of those words. "Why?" she asked flatly. "Plea deal," Reeves continued. "The charges were reduced after his lawyer argued for self-defense claims in the initial confrontation. You were labeled as a mutual combatant." The words twisted in her chest, but she stayed calm. "Mutual combatant? He stalked me. Threatened me." Reeves raised a hand gently, cutting her off. "I know, and believe me, I didn't sign off on this. But the system works on what it can prove in court. Rains agreed to probation and anger management. No further contact with you. On paper, he's finished." "On paper?" She exhaled slowly, forcing her heartbeat to stay even. "And off paper?" Reeves studied her closely as if weighing how much to say. Then his voice dropped lower. "Men like him, they don't forget. My advice, stay alert. Just because the court's done doesn't mean he is." She nodded once, absorbing the warning fully. But she had never let her guard down. Not really. "Thank you for the heads up, Lieutenant." Reeves hesitated, then offered a business card. "If anything feels off, or if he shows up again, call me directly. No delays." She took the card, watching as he left, the door closing behind him with a solid click. The house felt colder now. Not because of fear, but because the fight she thought had ended was circling back. That night, Emily sat in the quiet darkness of her living room, the rain beginning to patter softly against the windows once more. She stared at the card Reeves had given her, turning it between her fingers thoughtfully. Viper had been released. And though the law might have considered the matter settled, she knew better. Some threats didn't end with a sentence. They ended when the fight was truly taken from them. She wouldn't live in fear, but she would be prepared. Again. The rain continued through the night, steady and rhythmic against the windows as Emily sat in silence. The business card Lieutenant Reeves had left remained on the coffee table, its edges damp from where her fingertips had lingered too long. She had faced threats before, real threats. But this was different. This wasn't a war zone overseas. This was her home. And the knowledge that Viper was free, moving through the world unrestrained, made the air feel heavier than before. The justice system had released him with conditions, but conditions didn't stop men driven by wounded pride. She didn't feel fear, but she felt the inevitability of what would come next. By morning, the rain had cleared, but the tension remained. The day passed quietly, too quietly. Emily had learned to trust silence. It was often a predator's last move before the strike. She went about her day as usual, but kept alert, double-checking the locks, monitoring the security cameras more often than necessary. But nothing happened. Not that day, not the next. It was the waiting that felt most dangerous. 3 nights later, the first sign came. It was subtle. A shift. Emily was returning from an evening run, the sun long since set, mist curling around the quiet suburban streets. As she approached her house, she noticed the change immediately. The mailbox. It was ajar. Not forced, not vandalized, but open. And she never left it that way. Pulse steady, she approached cautiously, scanning the streetlights for movement. Nothing. Inside the mailbox was a single-folded piece of paper. No envelope. No handwriting visible from the outside. She unfolded it carefully. The message was short. I'm still watching. No signature, no threats. But the intent was clear. Emily's eyes narrowed, the tension in her chest sharpening into focus rather than fear. This wasn't a direct confrontation. This was psychological warfare, a test, and she was done being tested. The next morning, Emily filed the note with the police, providing a full report and copies of her security footage. Lieutenant Reeves was professional but cautious when he called back later that afternoon. We've noted it, but without a direct violation of his probation, there's not much we can pursue legally. She wasn't surprised, but she wasn't relying on the system. She was relying on herself. 2 days later, it escalated again. This time, it wasn't subtle. At exactly 3:12 a.m., the motion sensor in her driveway pinged her phone. Emily woke instantly, heart calm but alert as she checked the security feed. A figure, standing halfway up the driveway, just barely within the camera's reach. Viper. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. He knew the cameras were rolling. She could feel it. This was his way of showing power without technically violating the law. But she wasn't playing his game. She reached for her phone and dialed. Reeves, it's Emily. His voice was alert, tired. What's going on? He's here, at my house. I have him on camera. Reeves didn't hesitate. I'm sending a patrol now. Stay inside. But Emily wasn't just staying inside. She was watching. The feed showed Viper tilting his head slightly as if daring her to act first. His face was gaunt, pale under the dim streetlights, but his expression was sharp with bitter satisfaction. And then the headlights appeared. A squad car pulled onto the street, its lights cutting through the mist. Viper didn't run. He didn't even flinch. He simply walked away, calm, measured, just far enough to avoid confrontation when the officers arrived. By the time they reached her door, he was gone. The officer, younger and uncertain, took her statement but left with the same message. We'll file it, but without a direct threat. It's not enough. Emily understood, but she also knew it was enough. It was a message, and it wasn't over. Later that night, Emily sat by her window, the house silent except for the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. Rain tapped lightly against the glass again, the sound almost comforting. But her mind remained sharp. She knew Viper wasn't done. The question wasn't if he would return, it was when. And when he did, she wouldn't just be ready, she would end this. For good.